Warning, this video is intended for persons 13 years and over. Though the video's subject matter is media often aimed at children, it is talked about from an adult perspective. Thus it may contain language and themes unsuitable for younger audiences. What up, snitches? I'm the Animaniac, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but Disney have been remaking their classics with a few modern touches and editing out anything about their past that's worthy of awkward collar tucking. So starting today, I'm going to talk about every single mainline Disney animated movie, because if Disney are not going to acknowledge their sketchy past, then I guess I'll have to. Starting in 1937 with the OG of Disney princesses, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Directed by David Hand and based on the fairy tale of the same name by the Brothers Grimm, it's about a young maid who is deemed fairest in the land. That upsets the queen, so she orders someone to murder her, but she can't follow through with it. She runs off into the woods and comes across a cottage and the dwarves themselves. But when word gets back to the queen that Snow White is still alive, she plans to off her herself. Production of this film dates back to 1934 as Walt Disney hoped for more wealth and notoriety by producing animated features, at initially $250,000 before being extended to nearly $1.5 million, which for the time was pretty big for an animated feature. When Walt announced the film, the critics called it Disney's folly, and his wife and brother/business partner tried to talk him out of making the movie, but Walt and his team kept at this massive risk. Then, the very same critics who said Disney was nuts to make the film gave it a standing ovation at its premiere in 1937. When it went to theaters all across the US, it went on to become both the highest-grossing film of 1938 and the highest-grossing sound film at the time. That was until Gone with the Wind stole the record in 1940. After adding together the sales of its initial release and all the reissues over the years and adjusting for inflation, the total box office is $418 million worldwide. In the following year, Walt was awarded an honorary Oscar for Snow White by Shirley Temple. The statue was one big guy and 7 half-size guys, much like the characters of the film. The film was selected by the U.S. Library of Congress to be preserved in the National Film Registry in 1989, deeming it culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. And to this day, the movie holds a Rotten Tomatoes critical score of 98%. Now let's see if it's still worth all the acclaim it got after all these years. One thing I noticed when watching it for this review is that the film has a lot of padding, which in any movie that came out today would feel like a criticism. But the way this movie went about the extensions to the story to make it fit the 90-minute runtime made it feel natural and full of charm that endeared me to the characters, especially Snow White, whose gentle but firm nature was used to its greatest effect when she stayed with the dwarves, acting as their mother. Seriously, I felt like showing my hands and walking to the washing up trough in shame when she thought my palms were dirty, much like the dwarves.
March straight outside and wash, or you'll not get a bite to eat.
Yes, your majesty. But I was taken by her before she met the dwarves through the song she sang. Her singing voice is adorable. I could smile to her songs any day. In fact, all of the songs are still fun to hear. The animation on Snow White and the Prince was one of Disney's earliest instances of using rotoscoping. Partially. See, most of the animators who worked on the movie were newspaper cartoonists and weren't used to drawing in a realistic style, so they held classes in the studio during the production to train them to animate humans and animals realistically. Among these untrained but enthusiastic rogues was Grim Natwick. Before he was brought on board, he designed and animated Betty Boop for Fleischer Studios. He was tasked with animating Snow White for the film. Live-action footage for Snow White, the Prince, and the Queen was shot and only used partially, much to the chagrin of every animator on the film who saw it as a hindrance to effective caricature. But isn't that what the dwarves were for? I'm sure they realized that at some point later in the production. Walt encouraged his team to go see a variety of films to help influence them, from what was mainstream at the time to the obscure. Like Snow White's glass coffin was based off the one from Romeo and Juliet, and the look of the forest was inspired by German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Calgary and the unofficial but first adaptation of Dracula, Nosferatu, especially in the parts where the trees have faces, the logs take the form of crocodiles, and the bushes and branches turn into arms and start grabbing at Snow White. Doesn't that sound dodgy? And finally, the Queen's transformation scene was inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. During that same sequence, it contained a use of a multiplane camera that gave certain sequences a three-dimensional feel to them. This is noticeable when the camera spins around during the Queen's transformation scene. This must have been extremely impressive for 1937. To put it short, this movie looks fantastic. With it a few years away from being 100, Snow White and her 7 little men haven't lost their charm. This film was, and still is, perfect. Guys, what are your thoughts on this ageless beauty? Comment below. If you guys want to stay updated on future videos and see some cool artwork, be sure to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and DeviantArt, and be sure to subscribe to my second channel over on BitChute. The links are in the description. And if you want to be the first to know when a new video will be up, ring that bell after you subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.